So, if you recall, today's daf in the Sechet Sanhedrin is daf Samach Bet, so 62. And yesterday we had a machloket at the end of the day between Abaya and Rava. And the machloket was if a person worships an avodah zarah from love or fear, right? Remember, avodah zarah is very interesting because, and we're going to discuss this a lot today, because unlike like saying Shabbat, where you pick a turnip on Shabbat, you're chayt mechal Shabbat. Avodah zarah, you do an act which, in theory, an act could be patur, right? You bow down, which is not a problem if you're bowing down to a king, as we said yesterday, or if you're bowing down for exercise, right? But if you're bowing down with intent to worship, it's a problem. So if someone did their yoga in a temple, in a idol worshiping temple, that they wouldn't be chayav. No, it's not the smartest thing to do, right? But they wouldn't be chayav. So the intent is really important of avodah zarah because you either intend to worship or you don't intend to worship, right? Now, so that
But isn't it actually the concept of intent? Isn't it something that is like that we see throughout like mitzvot and everything? Because we talk about intent a lot when we talk about the Kohen Gadol and the Kohanim in general, and like when they do the avodah and
right.
we have the korbanot on all of that. So
So right. So intent is very important. And we're going to go through some of it today. We're not going to conclude everything. But there are certain acts that, especially lotase, something you're not supposed to do. The intent doesn't really matter, right? If a person sleeps with someone they're not supposed to sleep with, if they don't know they did it, right, or they don't know it was prohibited, that's a shogeg. But the fact that they could be doing it for medical reasons or something, I don't know, whatever it might be, doesn't change that they did the act, right? If a person eats what they're not allowed to eat, etc. What
I
you're
was
saying,
looking at it the other way.
right.
But
So in
okay.
mitzvot aseh, there's a whole discussion about whether you have to have kavanah for the mitzvah when you do the lulav or the Megillah or things like that. And as we of course have the intent when you do a karban is a little bit different because a karban basically comes for it to affect something, either to lead to forgiveness or to lead to something, and so you have to connect it to that effect basically. But in general, mitzvot don't require it. Now, of course, the other mitzvah, which I thought you were going to mention, which we're going to get to today, is Shabbat. Right? Shabbat, we do say melechet machshevet. You have to have intent. And so what does that mean exactly? And we're going to have a lot of parallels and differences between Shabbat and Avodah Zarah.
Yeah.
So on that background, Abaya and Rava had a machloket about someone who worshipped an idol, me'ahava u'miyira, which the simplest meaning, Rashi's and many other Rishonim, is that you did it not because you were committed to the theology of the idol, but because you loved someone who did it and you wanted to impress them or be with them.
Okay.
Or you were scared. Someone said to you, go and worship my idol, or I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to harm you. And you did it again. The harming doesn't have to be killing you necessarily. You did it not because you believed in it, but you knew it was an idol. You knew this is the way you worship it, and you decided in order to keep my job, it's worth doing or something, right? So that would be yirah. So Rava said you're pater, and because you're not worshiping it, and Abaya said you're chayav because you're still worshiping it. Okay, so said Abaya yesterday, and that's where we're going to start from.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to start from 5 lines in the bottom. Said Abaya, how do I know this? And he brings a case which is a very complicated case. Remember that the psukim, we're going to get to them very shortly in a few weeks, in Vayikra, talk about a karban chatat and who brings a karban chatat. And there are exceptions, right? An individual who sins b'shogeg brings a karban chatat, which is a kispa or seira. A kohen hamashiach who does a sin, who's helim davar, brings a par. A nasi yachata brings a sa'ir, we're going to talk about, right? And so there's different, and if the tzibur forgets, they bring a par as well. So now, when we say a Kohen Gadol brings a par, that's if they par helam davar a par. Sorry, shel Kohen Gadol par Kohen Mashiach is if they forget that something was wrong. Okay, meaning they forgot that this was prohibited. They didn't do it on purpose necessarily. So, or par Kohen par helam davar shel tzibor, right? It's where people got a ruling. You're allowed to eat this part of the meat with milk, and it turned out they couldn't, right? Um, However, when a person does avodah zarah, there's a different rule about which karban they bring bishogeg. And by avodah zarah, you only bring a seira instead of a kispa seira. You only bring a sa'ira avodah zarah, and that rule doesn't seem to change. We'll see in the Gemara a little bit when you reply to a kohen gadol and to other people. So says Abaya, let me read this Braita, and you'll see why this is going to lead to me thinking about something very strange about avodah Avodah zara mi yira umi ava. Titania, because the Braita says, now we're 5 lines from the bottom. Kohen Mashiach b'avodah zara, right? So Kohen who's anointed, who if they did a regular chet, they would bring a par. But what if they do avodah zara? Are they different than a regular Kohen, regular avera? So Rebbe says, b'shigagat masa. Rebbe said, well, yes, they're chayav, but only if they do a shogeg, meaning they forget, like a regular Jew who would be a regular person, not a Kohen Gadol, be chayav if they forget when they do the act. The Chachamim omrim behelem davar. No, Chachamim say it just like a Kohen only brings a par when he does a sin if helem davar, meaning they forgot that it was prohibited. So not that they knew, but they didn't know that they were doing the act, let's say. So they thought, meaning the helem davar means you forgot that the thing was prohibited, but you knew what you were doing, right? So too, by avodah zarah, you have to know that the thing is, you have to helem davar, you have to forget basically that the thing is wrong and do the act. Okay, and we're gonna ask in a second how you can worship an avodah zarah if you think it's okay, right? If you think what you're doing is okay, then you're not, by definition, worshiping the avodah zarah. So it should be not avodah zarah. But we'll read that in a second. Shavin says the Braita, they agree, meaning Rebbe and the Chachamim, shebesira ki yachid, that if the Kohen Gadol is chai for avodah zarah, whether it's helen davar or shogeg, they bring a seira like a yachid. Vishavim, and they also agree she'ein mevi asham taloi, that if he's unsure, you don't bring an asham taloi. Again, not our sugya at all. We'll get to this when we get to Sechet Kritut, which is going to be some time. Sorry, Hariyat. So ask the Gemara, though, for our purposes, 3 lines in the bottom, when you say a Kohen Gadol does avodah zarah b'shogeg, what does that mean? What does it mean you did a shogeg when you did avodah zarah? You forgot. If you forgot, meaning you thought that this temple was a temple to Hashem, and it turns out it was a temple to an idol, and you bow down in the Beit HaKnesset, but you thought it was for Hashem, and it turns out they said, oh, you didn't read the sign on the door, it says Saturn on the door, then that's not avodah zarah, because what your intent was to bow down to Hashem. You didn't, but that shouldn't be mechayev you. Ella, it must be the chaza indarta v'shtachavela. You saw an indarta. Darta means like a statue, like a sketchka, as we call it, and you bow down. So says the Gemara, meaning why, right? So says the Gemara, ikiblo la beloha. Well, if you saw this idol, the statue, and you bow down to it as accepting it as your god, then mezidhu, then you're doing avodah mezid, you should get killed, right? And top of samachbet lo kiblo la beloha. If you bow down to it because everyone else was doing it and you wanted to be part of them, but you were like not committing yourself to the religion, then lo klamu, you didn't do anything. You just went to an act. It doesn't matter. Elalav, it must be that what you did is you did it intentionally. You knew what you were doing, but you did it not from a belief. You did it me'avo, miyira, right? And do you see here that if you do this avodah shogeg me'ava miyira, you're chayav a carbon. Now, Rava, remember, claims that you're not chayav for shogeg, for ava yira. So how would Rava explain the Braita? So Rava would explain it to you in the second line of Samach Bet, but Omer Mutar. The case here is not where you did it and you knew it was prohibited, but you did it out of love or fear. It's where you thought this was permitted. You knew it was an idol, avodah zarah, and you made a mistake. Again, this is a Kohen Gadol, so everyone wonders, what school the Kohen Gadol went to. But he thought, God really likes when we worship idols who are subservient to God. And so the Kohen Gadol went into Saturn and said, I'm going to worship Saturn because I love and believe in this. But they thought it was permitted. That's the Torah wanted you to do it. Says Gemara, well, if you do Omer Mutar, that's not a shogeg, that's helen davar. That's where you forgot that the act was prohibited. And says Gemara, you're right. Omer mutar legamri. In fact, shogeg means where you go in and you say, I think this is completely permitted. What is halem davar, which literally means you forgot something? It means where you're kiyem mikzat ubitel mikzat. It's where you keep part of it and you cancel part of it, meaning you keep part of the mitzvah and you cancel the other part of the mitzvah. Let's say the person says, oh, I know that bowing down to Saturn is a problem, but I think bringing a carbon to Saturn is not a problem because we bring a carbon to Hashem, and bringing the carbon to Saturn is a way of serving Hashem shliach. So you know that it's Saturn. You know that if you bow down to it, well, I'm just using Saturn if it's Avodah Zarah, but because we had it yesterday, but if you bow down to it, you're chayav because Avodah Zarah, but you forget that this act is chayav. That's helen davar. And so that would be the explanation of the case, not necessarily Ava Yira. Okay. Says the Gemara now, 5th line from the top. And we're gonna unpack this more as we go. Tani Rabbi Zakkai kamed Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Zakkai, who was in Amora, taught over a Braita in front of Rabbi Yochanan. And he quoted the following Braita. The Braita says, remember, just like we're going to do a lot of comparisons to Shabbos here, but remember on Shabbos, you're not allowed to work, you're not allowed to break Shabbos. But of course, there's many, many melachot in Shabbat. So too, you can't worship Avodah Zarah, but there's many ways to worship Avodah Zarah. We said many in our Mishnah. Zivuach, Kiter, Nisech, Hashtachava, which were the big four, as we call them. Because in our Mishnah, we said you're chayiv no matter which idol you do it to, even if it's not the normal way of the idol. And there's more, right, if it's the way of the idol. But says Rabbi Zakkai, quoted over a bright in front of Rabbi Yochanan, that he learned that if a person forgets that it's an Avodah Zarah, or they forget that you're not allowed to worship Avodah Zarah, and they go and they do all four. There's Zibach, the Kiter, Nisech, and Ishtachava Behelem Echad, in one forgetting, in a chayiv ala achat. Well, you did one avodah azara, one avera avodah zara. You're only chayav one. Okay. Now, Amar le Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Zakkai, that is a mistake. Puk tni lebra. Go teach that outside. Meaning, get out of my Beit Midrash. That is not a valid.
Total nonsense.
It's not accurate. Okay. So that's it. He left. Rabbi Abba, no, maybe Rabbi Zakkai left, right? Says Rabbi Abba, I think that Rabbi Yochanan was being very harsh because, yeah, Rabbi Yochanan can disagree with that Braita. But in fact, it's a machloket Tanaim. Had Amar Rabbi Zakkai, machloket Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Natan. This is a machloket between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Natan, as the machloket that we've had 100 times before, or many. Right, the pasuk says, don't work on Shabbos. And then it says in Parsha Ki Tisa, Lo tevaru eish b'chol mashvatechem b'yom HaShabbat, don't burn fire. So if it says don't do any avoda, and fire is melacha, why does it say fire separately? And so we have a famous machloket, the Tanya, as the Braita says, Havara is mentioned specifically lilav yatzit. It's mentioned to tell you that unlike everything else on Shabbos that your chayiv you get killed for, if you burn a flame on Shabbos, you only have a lotase and you don't get killed, you just get makot. Okay? Divrei Rabbi Yossi. That's Rabbi Yossi's opinion. The reason Havara is mentioned is to tell you that it is punished differently. And Rabbi Natan says, Havara is said separately, l'chalik yatsa, to separate between the actions of Shabbat, meaning Shabbos, you can't, it's one Avera, don't do Shabbos, but there's 39 melachot. Right? The reason we mentioned just one of them is to tell you that each melacha of Shabbat is its own thing. If you forget, right, that you're not allowed to burn a fire and you're not allowed to dig and you're not allowed to, cut trees down, and you do all of those things, you cut down the tree, you dig it out, and you burn the fire, you're chayav 3 karbanot chatat. Right? So that's why we said Havara, to tell you, just like this is the individual, everyone's individual in some way. So says Rabbi Abba, Liman Amar Havara L'Lav Yatsa, according to the Tana that we just had, Rabbi Natan, Rabbi Yossi, that Havara is there just to tell you it's a lotase. So Ishtachava Nami L'Lav Yatsa, then you would say the same thing about Ishtachava, right? The Torah says, don't worship idols and don't bow down to them. Why say don't bow down to them if it's a form of worship? That's telling you that, in fact, when you bow down to them, you're only chayiv lotase. Now, this doesn't make any sense, right? Because we already said before that when you bow down, you're chayiv skila. But let's keep reading it. Leman Amar Havara L'Chalek Yatsa, but according to the second opinion, that Havara on Shabbos is said to tell you it's only that every amalacha of Shabbos is punished separately. Hishtachaba Nami L'Chalek Yatsa. So Hishtachaba is there to tell you the same thing, and that's exactly what Rabbi Abba what Rabbi Zakkai came and said from the Braita, right? Sorry, that's the opposite of Rabbi Zakkai. Rabbi Zakkai said you do all four, you only chayiv one. That must have been like the first opinion, not like the second opinion. So I understand that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't like that opinion, and he doesn't paskin that way, and he said kick him out, but he really shouldn't kick him out. It's a machloket Tanaim, and he was quoting one of the Tanaim. So that was what Rabbi Abba tried to justify. Now, Matkif Rav Yosef on the last narrow line, said Rav Yosef, that's not compelling at all. Why are you comparing Shabbos to Avodah Zarah? Because Dilma, Ad kan lokam Rabbi Yossi hatam. Rabbi Yossi only said by Shabbos that Havara L'Lav Yatsa, that Havara is there to tell you that it's only a lotase, because he says, I don't need a pasuk to tell you that every melacha of Shabbos is separate. Right, the two options are Havara is to tell you it's a lotase, the lav yatsa, or Havara is a lechalek yatsa, to tell you that you're chayiv separately for each melacha of Shabbos. But maybe the reason that Rabbi Yossi doesn't say that is because he already knows that. He already knows that different melachot have different punishments, meaning you could be punished for many melachot. From the pasuk achat mehena. That's a very strange pasuk. The Tanya, we have this braita, we've had again also many times, a very complicated braita, because when the pasuk talks about in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, Parshat Vayikra, it talks about bringing a karban chatat. It says nefesh techateh, right? A person sins, the asa, and they do me'achat mehena, from one of them, right? One of the singular, of the plural, right? Now, really, it shouldn't have said any of that. It should have said asa avera, asa achat shalos, whatever. But what does it mean? You do one and you do them. So the Braita, Rabbi Yossi teaches in the Braita, again, we've had this, it's a very famous Braita, that we darshan every word and every subword in that pasuk, meaning, pa'amim shechayev achat al kulam. Sometimes you're chayev one for doing many averot. And pa'amim shechayev achat b'achat. Sometimes you're chayev for each individual avera. And that's what Rabbi Yossi said. And said, Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Rabbi Yonatan commented on that braita, the third line. What does Rabbi Yossi mean? My time into Rabbi Yossi. Dichtiv, because the pasuk says, V'asa me'achat mehena. Right, a person does, it could have just said vasa achat, right? But it says me'achat, which means from one or part of one, mehena, from them or part of them. So we darshan from this the following: that you're chayav for a karban chatat, for achat, if you do one, me'achat, if you do part of one, heina, if you do them, and me'heina, if you do some of them. What does that mean? Sorry, those are four. Plus a fifth one, achat shehi heina. Sometimes you can do one that is many, and sometimes heina she achat, you could do many that are one. Now, that's what all six of those are. So let's go simply. Let's do one at a time. The word achat. You do one avera, that's if come Shabbos, you're not allowed to write on Shabbos, right? You sit down and you say, I'm going to write a letter to my friend Shimon. And you sit down and you write the word Shimon. That's writing on Shabbat, you're chayiv mita, right? Or sorry, if you forgot it was Shabbat, you forgot that you're not allowed to write, you're chayiv a karban chatat. What does me'achat mean? Part of one. Let's say you start writing a letter to your friend Shimon, but you only get through the first two letters and you remember that it's Shabbos, or you remember it's prohibited. And you write the word shame, in the letter shin mem, me shimon, right? You start writing. Well, then you're also chayav, because remember, writing means you have two letters that form a word. And the word shame is a word, right? It's a name. And you intended to write it. It's not like, remember, if you're trying to write a different word, like you're trying to write, I don't know, abracadabra, and you write abra, you didn't really mean that. I don't know if that's a word. But anyways, you didn't mean to write a word. But the word shame is a word, and you intended to write it. So you're chayav me'achat, if you do part of one on Shabbat. The word heina, of course, is them, refers to the avot. It refers to the categories, like you're not allowed to do borer. Remember, there's 10 ways to do borer or more, but you can't do them. Mei heina is the toldot. That's as we went through in Masechet Shabbat, the avot and the toldot. So you can't do those, and if you do those, you're chayav a karban chatat if you do a b'shogeg. That's four. What is achachi heina? What does it mean? One that is many. That is, if let's say Zadon Shabbat, you remember. Zadon means you what you know. You know that it's Shabbat, but Shikigat Melachot, you forget that you're not allowed to plant and you're not allowed to harvest. You're not allowed to borer, right? You're not allowed to mix, separate, right?
Separate.
I'm sorry, you do all those things, right? But you know it's Shabbos, you just forgot. Well, then you have to you did one Isser Shabbat, but you have to do many karbanot. Because since you knew it was Shabbat and you forgot three different aspects of Shabbat, you bring three different karbanot, right? And so, of course, that's where we're going to stop and say that's the limud, that every melacha of Shabbat is the chalek, right? But let's finish the braita. Heina shi'achat. What does it mean? You did many things and you only chayiv one karban. That's if let's say you're shigagat Shabbat, you forget that it's Shabbos, right? And you go ahead and do all 10 melachot. You know that you're not allowed to do malacha on Shabbat, but you think today's Tuesday or Sunday. So then you only bring one karban, because even though you did 10 things wrong, you only forgot one thing. You forgot Shabbat. So that's where you do many things and it becomes one, right? But you basically see that there's another source that tells you that you can be chayiv many karbanot chatat for violating Shabbat, right? For one forgetting of Shabbat, basically. Avol hacha, but here by avodah zarah, It's not comparable at all. There's no other pasuk. There's no other source to teach us that there's something called chiluk melachot. And therefore, why don't we say that kuli alma, that everybody would say ishtachava l'chalik yatsa, that every Tana would hold that the reason the Torah says ishtachava separate from the category of avodah zarah is to tell you that every way you worship is a separate chatat. In which case, the Tana who was quoted by Rabbi Zakkai is wrong, right? Because the Tana said if you do all four in one forgetting, you're chayiv one. But it turns out everyone agrees that there's a chiluk, then you're chayiv for each one. Says the one, well, 1 second. The pasuk that you just quoted to me that tells you that chiluk melachot and Shabbat is not talking about Shabbat. It's talking about carbon chatat, where you bring a carbon. So why can't you say it's referring to every avera, including avodah zarah? So chiluk melachot avodah zarah, the fact that you're shvichayev separately for avodah, for each melacha avodah zarah, nami tepik miachat mihina. Why do we need hishtachava to tell you that? Learn it from achat mihina. Achat meaning zvicha. So remember, you have to read the whole pasuk now. Achat means you do an act, which is you slaughter an animal. Me'achat means you do part of an act, in which case you slaughter an animal, but you only cut one siman, which is enough to be chayev, because by a bird you'd be chayev, and that's one way of slaughtering. Heina means the avot, the 4 avot, right? Zivuach, kitur, nisuch, and nishtachava. Zivuach, kitur, nisuch, nishtachava. Mehena means the toldot. Now, what's a toldot, right? How do you have a tolda of avodah zarah? So the Gemara is a beautiful example. The Gemara's example is, let's say you have an avodah zarah, that the way you would worship the avodah zarah would be by bringing sticks to it. I don't know why, but that's the worship. And you, instead of this person who worships the Avodah Zarah, instead of bringing a stick, they actually slaughter a stick. And the way you slaughter a stick is you break a stick, right? But you sacrifice a stick in front of the idol. So that's a tolda of that idol, basically. It says Gemara, Shavar Makel Lefaneh. It's where you break a stick in front of an idol, which was worshipped by bringing sticks. So you'd be chayiv in that case. And then achat sheyena, where you could do one sin that leads to many karbanot. Maybe that means you're zadon avodah zarah. You know that you're not allowed to worship avodah zarah, but you forget that the way you worship it is slaughtering an animal and a shtachava. So you're shigagat avodot, just like with Shabbat, and you'd be chayiv according to this reading of the Braita, many karbanot, because even though you only did one sort of forgetting, you forgot several different acts. And heina shiachat, and the fact that you could do many things and only bring one karban would be the opposite, where you're shigagat avodah zarah, v'zdon avodot. You forget that it's avodah zarah, and you do all the melachot. So maybe that is a way to understand that everyone would agree that on avodah zarah, you're chayiv separately for each avodah, right? Now, before we answer that question, says Gemara, slow down. What about the concept that we've asked several times now? How do you have shogeg of avodah zarah, right? I understand that you can, shogeg of Shabbat, you forget it's Shabbat, you know what you're doing, right? But how do you have shogeg of avodah zarah? You forget idol worship is prohibited, but you know you're bowing down, but that's not avodah zarah because you think you're bowing down. Well, let's read it. Hi shogegat avodah zarah hechidami. What does it mean that you have a shogeg of avodah zarah? If you think, okay, I'm going into the temple of Hashem, it's the Beit Knesset, and you go and you worship and you bow down, or you slaughter an animal, you bring a gift, but it turns out that it was an avodah zarah. But you already shamayim. You didn't mean to worship an idol; you meant to worship Hashem or whatever. Ella, it must be, as we said earlier, the chaza in Darta, you saw a idol, you saw a statue, visagilei, and you bow down to it. Says Gemara again, what was your intention? Ikiblo Allah. If you said I'm bowing down to accept this as a god, then Mesinu, then you're a Chai Mason. You're not a shogeg. Lo kiblo Allah lo klumu. If you didn't accept it, then you didn't do anything, right? Because you're just bowing down for fun or to be like everybody else, but you're not doing it for idol worship. Ella, as we said again before, it's just a repetition. It must be where you did it me ahava mi yira. So you did it not because you really wanted to, but you knew exactly what you were doing, and that's called shogeg. So Hanichala Abaya, who said that you're chayiv if you Damar chayav. El Rava Damar Patur Ma'ikalamim. Rava says you're not chayiv in that case. So what do you mean? You don't need to bring a karban, right? Ella says, well, you're right. It must be where you thought Omer Mutar. You thought to yourself that in general you're allowed to worship idols, right? That was your mistake. So your unawareness, your shogeg of avodah zarah is not where you didn't know what you were doing or you didn't know the action. You knew that this is an idol, You knew that the way to worship the idol, it says on the wall, the way to worship this idol is by bowing down. You bowed down, but you've thought that bowing down to an idol was permitted. So says Mar, if that's the case, Tifshel deboy mine Rav and Rav Nachman. Why can't we then be poshet? We can clarify the question, the famous question Rav asked Rav Nachman, which was, let's say, Helim ze v'ze biyado. Right? Remember, we said about Shabbos that if a person does three melachot, and they remember Shabbos, but they forget they are not allowed to plant or plow or harvest on Shabbos. And they do all three of those things, they bring three karbanot. If they remember that you're not allowed to do those things on Shabbos, but they think today is not Shabbos, and they do those three things, they bring one karban, because the helim is just one. What about if they forget both? What if they forget today is Shabbos, and they forget that you're not allowed to do these things on Shabbos, right? So they think today is Sunday, and they think that you can plow and plant on Shabbos. And they do those three things. So do you say that's one forgetting or three forgettings? So that was the question that Rava asked Rav Nachman. Helim zeb zeb yadomau. If a person forgets both, right? They forget that it's Shabbos, and they forget that you can't do this on Shabbos, and they do three things. How many karbanot do you bring? So why can't you now resolve from this discussion, tifshot de'eno chayev elachat? You can resolve from here that just like by avodah zarah, you're only a chayav one if you forget, right? This is a case of omer mutar. So you said it was permitted. Omer mutar means you think there's no problem. You think there's no idol, and there's no way to worship the idol. So it says you're only chayiv one in our case. So why can't you prove from here that by Shabbos you'd also be only chayiv one? Then we're okay, but that's so good point. Halakasha, tifsha. So yeah, so I think that's not a problem. Maybe this is a clarification of that. I mean, the fact that there's a question somewhere else and we have a good proof is great. Write it down. So that doesn't bother us. But ask the Gemara now, and where are we? 3 lines in the bottom. I've got a much more fundamental problem. Right? The pasuk says, "V'asa me'achat mehina b'shogeg." You have to bring a karban, and we said it's referring to Shabbos, that you can do one thing on Shabbos that's many, and many things that's one. And then where I said, why don't you apply that to avodah zarah as well? And it's telling you that you can do one form of serving avodah zarah that you'd be chayiv many for, and you'd be chayiv for many forms, many ways of serving avodah zarah that you'd be chayiv one. It says more, but you can't say that. Because min matzim mukbid lahani kroy b'avodah zarah, this pasuk can't be referring to avodah zarah because it's referring to a regular karban chatat. And I just told you in the introduction to today's daf that a avodah zarah you bring a separate kind of karban chatat. So clearly, it's referring to every avera potentially, but avodah zarah. The lohacha in this pasuk in the beginning of Vayikra Ktiv, it says, well, it depends on who you are. If you're a Kohen Mashiach, you bring a par. If you're a Nasi, you bring a Sayer. If you're a Yachid, you bring a Kispo Seira. But Ilo Bavodah Zaratznan, as we again started today's daf, we tipped you off, that Shavin Shebesira Kibiyachid. We learned in the Mishnah that if you bring if a individual or a Kohen Mashiach or a Nasi does Avodah Zarah, they bring a Seira. So clearly, this parsha cannot be referring to Avodah Zarah, V'tu lo midi, and that's the end of the discussion. Clearly, this has nothing to do with Avodah Zarah, and you can't say that this pasuk is a limud that you're mechalek avodot for Avodah Zarah. And therefore, what Rav Yosef asked, and the first wide line, first narrow line, last narrow line, Rav Yosef asked stands, and it's a good question. And now we know why Rabbi Yochanan kicked him out. So don't teach that here. But too long midi. So that is one long version of this very complex stuff. Says Gemara, let's do version 2. Okay. Kiata Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda came to Bavel, right? Usually come from Eretz Yisrael. Amar, he said, turn the page to Daf Samach Bet on the bet. I actually had a whole different sort of version of this story. And the version I have is that Reb Zakkai said a different Brighton from Reb Yochanan, and Reb Yochanan kicked him out. But I'll tell you what the other Brighton was. Hachi Taneh Kameh. This is what Reb Zakkai said in front of Reb Yochanan. He didn't say what we said for the first half of today's daf, that if a person does avodah zarah b'shogeg and he bows down and he brings an animal and he does whatever zivuach and kitur, he's only chayiv one, right? Which is what Rev the first version, Reb Zakkai, right? That's not what he said. He said the following. And now I'll read the Breita from the top of Daf Samach Bet on the bet. He said the following. Chomer b'Shabbat mishar mitzvot. That Shabbos has stringencies that are more than other mitzvot or other averot. And chomer b'shar mitzvot sheb'Shabbat, and sometimes it's the opposite. Other mitzvot are more strict than Shabbat. How does that make sense? Chomer b'Shabbat, in Shabbat, Shabbat asa shtayim helem echad chayv al kol achad v'achad, right? If you do two things, you plant and you plow on Shabbat, forgetting that these are prohibited on Shabbat, you have to bring two karbanot. They're two different acts. Mashenkim b'shar mitzvot. In other mitzvot, we're going to see in a second what the example of another mitzvot. If you do two things wrong with one and forgetting that it's wrong, you only bring one karban. So that's where Shabbos is more chamer. But chomer b'shar mitzvot, sometimes the other mitzvot are more chamer. Sheb'shar mitzvot shagag v'lo mitkaven chayav. Right? Other mitzvot, as I mentioned earlier, if you do a shogeg, you forget it, but you have no intention to doing it, you're chayav. But mashenkim is Shabbat. But on Shabbat, if you don't have a kavanah, remember, davar shalom nitkaven on Shabbat is not even bringing a karban chatat. So Shabbat needs mlachet machshavet, where you don't need by other things. Now, let's try to understand what this braita means. Amar Mar. Says Gemara, let's analyze the braita. It says chomer b'Shabbat, because on Shabbat, if you do two things, b'alam echad, you're chayiv twice, but by other mitzvot, you're not. Now, hiti dami, what does it mean if you do two things on Shabbat? Ilema, it must mean, or if you say it means, that you did avad ketziro techina, right? You did harvesting and grinding. So you forgot that you're not allowed to harvest and grind on Shabbat, and you did both of those things. So then you're chayiv two chatot. But why can't you say that by another mitzvot, the kavatei gabe shar mitzvot, the achal chela v'dam, right? Let's say you went and you ate prohibited parts of an animal. So you ate the blood, which you can. You ate the fat of the animal. So you'd also be chayiv too. Hachnami tarti mechayiv, right? Hachatarti mechayiv, hachatarti mechayiv. By Shabbos you're chayiv too, and by eating you're chayiv too. Ella. So how do you understand that? Ella, what you mean is, hey, gabi shar mitzvot te'enu chayiv elachat. When you do other mitzvot and you do two acts, you only chayiv one karban. Hechidami. What's the case of that? It must be where you do the same thing twice. You eat one cheeseburger, not cheeseburger. You eat one, burger of chelev, which is prohibited, and then you eat a second one. You didn't remember in between that this is prohibited. You the whole time forgot that this was a problem, so you only bring one karban. But if that's the case by other mitzvot, what the equivalent case of Shabbat is, the kavatei gabe Shabbat, the equivalent case of Shabbat is where you did the same act twice. Abi kitzira, right? You went out Shabbos morning, you forgot that you're not allowed to harvest, you harvested, and then you went out in the afternoon and harvested. But there's no difference. By Shabbos, you'd be chayiv one, because it's the same act. By other mitzvot, you'd be chayiv one. So why are we saying there's a difference, right? And Hainu Damerle, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan kicked him out. Puktani Livra. That's why Rabbi Yochanan said, get out of here. This doesn't make any sense. Shabbos is not more chamer. Because it's true, sometimes in Shabbos you're chayiv twice, if you do two different melachot, Zriya and Kitzira, right, or whatever. But if by another avera, if you did two different acts, you'd be chayiv twice also. So why would this braita say that? It says, slow down. I don't really think that's a good reason to kick someone out of the Beit Midrash. Why? Because my kushya, why in the world are you pretending that this is such a problem? We got the place, it's around 12 or so lines in the middle of the line. My kushya, Dilma, why don't you explain the braita the following way? I'll tell you the avik katsira tchina, right? That on Shabbos, you two different actions, right? And the two different actions of Shabbos were you forgot that you're not allowed to plant, your katsira's harvest, you forgot you're not allowed to grind, and you did both of those things. So you chayiv two karbanot. Everyone agrees with that. And when we say mashenkim b'shar mitzvot, that the same would not be true by other mitzvot, it doesn't mean you ate blood and you ate fats. Those are two different things. It's referring to avodah zarah. Avodah zarah can do Rabbi Ami. It's referring to exactly what Rabbi Ami said by avodah zarah. Damar Rabbi Ami zivach v'kiter v'niseich v'elam echadim v'chayav olachat. Rabbi Ami quoted a braita which said that if you do all the forms of avodah zarah with forgetting that they're prohibited, right? You remembered it's an avodah zarah. You remember you're not allowed to worship avodah zarah, but you forgot that these are ways to worship an avodah zarah. So you bow down and you killed an animal and you burned incense, whatever. You're only chayiv one, so that's different than Shabbos. Because on Shabbos, if you forgot that you can't plant and harvest and you did both, you're chayiv two. So maybe that's what it means. Says Gemara, well, yeah, but you can't explain this braita referring to avodah zarah. Lomi took me avodah zarah. This braita can't be referring to avodah zarah. Diktani seifa, because the flip side that the braita quoted was sometimes other mitzvot are more than Shabbos, right? Chomer b'shar mitzvot, sheb'shar mitzvot shagay v'lo mitkaven chayav. If you do other mitzvot by mistake without even intending to do the act, but you do the act, then you're chayav. And on Shabbos you're not. But how in the world could you have shogeg v'lo mitkaven b'avodah zarah? Right? I understand you could have shogeg v'lo mitkaven by eating, milk and meat. right? You forgot that you're not allowed to eat milk and meat. You didn't know there was milk in what you did. You had no intention to do it, right? That's below mitkavein. But how do you have such a case by avodah zarah? Again, the third time we have these words today. Hechidami. How do you forget and not know something is avodah zarah? Either kasaver beit hakneset u'shtachah be'elo. If you thought this is God's house and you bow down and you find out that it's not, it doesn't, that's not avodah zarah. Libo l'shamayim. Your intention was to worship Hashem. Ella must be, again, the case we've had 3 times. The chaza andarta, you see a statue, v'tzagida, and you bow down to it. So again, did you bow down to it for worship or you bow down to it for, I don't know, social norms? If you accept it as a god, then mezenu, then you're bowing down to worship a god. Ilo kibla Allah, if you don't accept it, then lo klumu, it's just bowing down, tying your shoelace in front of an idol. That's not avodah. Ella, coming back, it must be mi'avo mi'ira, as we said many times already. The most likely explanation is, how do you do avodah zarah b'shogeg, where you know it's avodah zarah, but you feel like you're forced into it? So hanicha le'abaya, that makes sense according to Abaya, who says that in such a case you'd be chayiv a shogeg, a korban. Damar chayiv, el Rava damar pater ma'ik lamemer. What is Rava going to say? Ella, Rava would have to tell you, like he told you earlier today, omer mutar. Right, it's talking about a case where the person thought that this was completely mutar. So meaning they thought not only are you allowed to do this act of avodah zarah, but they thought that the whole concept of avodah zarah was permitted, right? Meaning they forgot that there's such a prohibition. So then that should be, and you're saying by avodah zarah you're chayav, but by Shabbos you're pater, right? Because masha'en came b'Shabbat to pater the gamri. That if you say I don't forget that there's such a thing as Shabbat, you're pater. Now says the Gemara, no one says that. Because Adkan lo boy mine Rav Amir of Nachman. Remember we said that Rav asked of Nachman, let's say you're Halem Zevazeh. You forget that you're not allowed to plant or harvest. You forget it's Shabbos, and you then do both actions. Are you chayiv one or you chayiv many? But no one's saying you're not chayiv anything, right? What you're saying now is that if by avodah zarah, if you forget it's avodah zarah, you have to bring a korban. But by Shabbos, if you forget that it's Shabbos, you don't bring anything. But that's not true. So only Rav asked Rav Nachman if you're Helam Zevazah, are you chayiv one, or are you the chiyuv tarti, or you chayiv two? But pater the gami lekleman number. No one says you're pater for being mechal Shabbat if you forget that it's Shabbos. Says the Gemara, okay, yeah, fine. So the first part of the Braita might be talking about avodah zarah, where on Shabbos, if you do many things in one heading, you're chayiv many times. Avodah zarah, if you do many things in one heading, you're chayiv only once. And the second part of the Braita is referring to other mitzvot, not avodah zarah, because it's true. If you forget that it's an avodah zarah and you worship it, then you won't be chayiv. But if you forget that you're not allowed to sleep with, a married woman and you do it, you are chayiv, right? A shogeg. So my kushya, Dilma Olamei Melacha, why can't you just interpret the Braita to be Reisha b'avodah zarah? The first part of the Braita, which says Chomer b'Shabbat Mishar Mitzvot, is referring to avodah zarah, and the Sefer is B'Shar Mitzvot, right? And how do I explain that? What on Shabbos are you putter for? Because on Shabbos, Shagag below mitkavein, let's say, right, you do Shogeg below mitkavein, where we say you're putter on Shabbos, but you're chai with another Avera. The other Avera would be the Kasavar Roku below. Right, you find a little piece of fat, basically, and you think, oh, this is spit, this is not fat, right? And you swallow it. So that you don't even know you're eating. It's not that you're eating and you think this thing is okay. You don't even know that you're eating because you think it's not food. It turns out you're wrong. It was food. It was prohibited food. You ate it. You have to bring a korban. But the equivalent on Shabbos, right? Mashen came Shabbat to patur. When are you patur on Shabbos? Let's say on Shabbos you go out and you say, there's a apple on the ground and you think it's detached from the ground, right? Or a tree, whatever. Like it's not an apple. You have a cucumber on the ground and you go and you pick it up, right? You think you're picking up a cucumber that was already detached. And it turns out that you cut it. You cut something which was attached. There, you're pater. And why are you pater? Kid Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. Damar hamit asek, as Rav Nachman Bar Shmuel said. Where am I? Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel, we're 7 lines in the bottom. Hamitasek. Mitasek means you do an action with completely no intention, right? Meaning you do it and you have no, you're completely unaware of what you're doing or, the implication, meaning you're picking something up, you think it's attached, you think it's detached from the ground. You have no idea that you're detaching it when you pick it up. So Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel said, if you are mitasek by chalavim, if you do that with fat, meaning with food, or ba'arayot, so you don't know that you're sleeping with someone, right? You don't know that's a person, let's say. You don't know, whatever. You don't know that you're eating something. You think you're just swallowing spit, but you're chayav. In those cases, it is chayav shekein naneh, because you got the benefit of the act of arayot, or the act of eating. But if you're mitasek b'Shabbat, if you completely don't know what you're doing on Shabbat, you're patur, because melechet machshavet asra Torah, because melechet machshavet is prohibited, but nothing else. So I don't understand, says the Gemara. Last thing we're going to say, we've got a beautiful explanation. This Braita that Rabbi Yochanan said, get out of the Beit Midrash, could make a ton of sense if the first part of the Braita is referring to Chomer Shabbat from Avodah Zarah, right? That if you do many types of Malacha on Shabbat, you're chayiv many times. If you do many types of Avodah Zarah, you're only chayiv once. And the second part of the Braita, which says, and Chomer by other things, that if you do them by mistake, you're chayiv, and Shabbat, you're patur, is referring not to Avodah Zarah, because you can't do Avodah Zarah by mistake, but it's referring to eating things or arayot, where you are chayiv if you do it by mistake, because you benefited from it. So why can't you explain the Braita that way? Says the Gemara, the reason is because Rabbi Yochanan has a long-standing opinion, 4 lines in the bottom, Rabbi Yochanan litamei. This is Rabbi Yochanan's long-standing opinion that everybody should know. De lo mukim matnita reisha bechad tama b'seifa bechad tama. Rabbi Yochanan never likes that principle. He never says, well, take a Braita, the first part of the Braita is one Tana, the second part's another Tana, unless they say that, right? But if it's a Stam Braita, Rabbi Yochanan never accepts that it's a reasonable teaching to split the identities of the first part and the second part of the Braita. And
We see this in other places in Shas.
we do. So that's what the Gemara quotes, the Gemara in Bava Metzia, which might be what you remember. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, remember as we said in Bava Metzia, Rabbi Yochanan was quoted as saying, "Man dimitargim li chavit aliba dechad Tana." The person who can explain the Mishnah of chavit, which remember is a Mishnah in Avodas in Bava Metzia, which talked about when you have a barrel that you're watching and you stop watching and you come watching it again. Anyways, what Rabbi Yochanan said again, that we don't. The purpose for us, the Mishnah is not the issue, but the purpose for us is what Rabbi Yochanan is quoted as saying, if you can explain the Mishnah according to one Tana, meaning don't give me any explanation that the first part of the Mishnah is going like Rabbi Yehuda and the second part is going like Rabbi Meir or something like that. If you can explain this Mishnah like one Tana, Movilna mane batre lebe masuta, I'll carry your clothing behind you to the bathhouse, right? That was always I will be your servant for a day. So meaning I'll be very beholden to someone who does that. Clearly that's Rabbi Yochanan's desire, is to explain a Mishnah according to one opinion. And therefore, he said this Braita that Rabbi Abba came and quoted, again, even in the second version of Rabbi Zakkai came and quoted, doesn't make any sense, because you can't have Chomer b'Shabbat me shar mitzvot unless you're talking about Avodah Zarah. And if you're talking about Avodah Zarah, the second part of the Braita doesn't make any sense. And therefore, because you need intent for Avodah Zarah, almost the same way you need intent for Shabbat, you can't explain the second part of the Braita, and that's why he said, Huk Tani Libra, go get that out of here. So we're going to stop there. That was a very complicated daf, but
Yeah.
I'm sure we got it. The Gemara continues. We're not done about this question about, when you do many avodot after Avodah Zarah in one helim, the same way of many avodot of Shabbat. That we got to the last word. Okay, good. We did it.
Thank
3 days in
you.
a row, Miriam. God willing, I'll see you next month. Say Shabbat.
Lina there.
Have a good week.
You too.